Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin in Berkeley, California. Bob is out today, but I am joined by Collin Rees, who is the U.S. campaign manager with Oil Change International, who is in Belem, Brazil at COP30, also known as the Conference of Parties, which is the UN climate talks. Welcome, Collin, to the Green and Red podcast. Welcome back. Actually, Collin is a return guest. I didn't say that part.
I am. Thank you so much, Scott. Good to be here.
Yeah. And so COP30, which is seems like a pretty big deal. COP is happening this year in Belem, Brazil, which is actually one of the gateways into the Amazon. We've been already seeing sort of media coming out of Belem around the negotiations and what's going on in the street. So maybe just to give a brief overview, could you talk a little bit about what is happening on the ground so far and any big issues at stake that has arisen to the surface?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of main pieces that we're seeing already. The climate talks, as you mentioned, happen every year, but the context is quite different every year. Not only do global politics change, but where the talks are hosted and who the presidency is has a pretty big impact on how they go, essentially. And so there are two big things that I think I've noticed so far at COP30. One is the big focus of the year is on just transition. That is a contested term, as we all experience. What is a just transition? Who that applies to? These are all things that have been fought over for many years. That's no different at the international climate level. And so a lot of the discussion, is there going to be some sort of mechanism on just transition that comes out of it? What can countries agree to? And then crucially, what's the support to back that up? Is there going to be finance available to actually make that just transition a reality for countries in the global south in particular? We don't even see that at the moment in the global north funding for a just transition, let alone in the global south. So is that going to materialize? And secondly, what is the role of actually phasing out fossil fuels in that just transition? We've seen in these talks over and over, there's a lot of talk about reducing emissions. We finally essentially forced a conversation about actually transitioning away from fossil fuels for the first time 2 years ago at COP28. That was the first time that ending fossil fuels had ever been mentioned in a climate talks document, which seems completely insane, but it just shows you the limitations of this process, I think. And so that conversation has finally started, but now there have been attempts to walk it back. Of course, then how real that commitment becomes is going to determine how just that transition can be. And so just transition is the big fight inside the COP. It's the pretty early stages still. It's 4 days out of an anticipated 10 or 11. There's not been huge developments in the negotiations so far. What happens is people feel each other out, countries feel each other out and see where positions are. And then often things heat up a little bit more in the second week as we get to it. So that's where the talks are at right now, essentially a little too early to have hit the roadblocks that we are sure are coming. But the other, I think, really notable thing about being in Belem from a movement perspective is that this is the first COP in 4 years where there are people's movements in the streets in a real way. The COP has been in pretty authoritarian states that are fossil fuel dominated in many cases, very heavily militarized, and it was not safe for people to take action, whether those people were locals or people coming into the climate talks for the last few years. That's different in Brazil. Brazil is not a perfect country, but there's a lot more freedom for civil society. There are beautiful people's movements and incredible indigenous movements from Brazil. We're up here not in Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro or some of the big cities of Brazil, but up at the mouth of the Amazon at a smaller city. And so very close to a lot of Amazonian people's communities. There has been just yesterday launched the People's Summit, almost with beautiful ceremony, a traditional barquetas, as it's called, a boat parade of hundreds and hundreds of boats sailing along the Amazon and kind of meeting up at the People's Summit. And that's complementary programming, I think, to what's happening here at the talks. It's certainly a very different feel, not in these sterile rooms, but in an actual people's assembly. And so that's happening for the next few days. And on Sunday, there's going to be an outcome from that People's Summit, a document, a list of demands, not quite sure, but that will be handed over ceremoniously to the presidency of the COP and the negotiations as they head into their second week. That's happening. There's going to be a beautiful big march on Saturday. I think it's just really the vibrancy and the sense of real climate movement is much more real than it has been for a few years.
And I saw a video of an indigenous march that sort of stormed into the conference space. Is that right?
That is right. Yeah. And I think there's been, as with anything, there's been some coverage on all sides here. I think one of the ones that I saw that summarized it the best and that did get it right, I think, is that those indigenous folks were not trying to destroy the conference. They were not trying to say we don't want climate action. Obviously not that. They were in fact saying, no, our voice is really critical here. There hasn't been enough done to make this process open to civil society and to groups on the ground, to frontline communities. That is absolutely true. And so they were making a statement. They did some ceremony and then they moved on. And so I think it's made the politics a little bit more trickier, but I think that's the reality of life when you are actually interacting with people and people's lived experiences dealing with the climate crisis. It's not always easy. And I think that's important to reflect in the process of these talks.
And you talking about how when the sort of message was our voices, there's not enough of our voices are in here. Our voices aren't being heard enough. We do actually see another group of people whose voices are overly heard, which is something usually when we do shows on COP, I always like to bring this up. The fossil fuel industry presence at COP is last year was in Azerbaijan, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. Baku, yeah.
Baku. And there was like a lot of industry, fossil fuel lobbyists there. There's even more there now this year. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think this is an unfortunate development in some ways that we've seen over the last few years in particular, a real proliferation of fossil fuel lobbyists attending the COP, being involved in even in party delegations, in fake astroturf NGOs, essentially showing up and working pretty overtime to block progress and to counteract the voice of civil society, even as the climate justice movement has gotten a lot stronger and bolder and the youth movement has risen up. And that's bad for the process. It's not good for making progress. I do think that it's a sign that there is progress being made. I think it's interesting to me that for many years, there wasn't as much involvement, in part because there wasn't real discussion of the problem being fossil fuels, or fossil fuels is the key driver of the climate crisis. I'm not saying it's good in any way, but I do think it's a sign that we're having some impact and that things are starting to shift. There are, as you mentioned, over 1,600 fossil fuel lobbyists here at COP. That's higher than last year, even though that was in a very fossil fuel dominated country. And it's the highest percentage of overall attendees. If 1 out of every 25 attendees is a fossil fuel lobbyist, which is frankly horrifying. You're in rooms with hundreds of people, and that means there's sometimes dozens of fossil fuel lobbyists in the room. I'm sitting in a pavilion here, and I can just over there, I can see the business pavilion. The International Chamber of Commerce and the International Emissions Trading Association is hosting a pavilion that's got Chevron speaking. I believe Shell and BP are there as well. Petrobras, Petronas, like oil companies all over the world. And so you're seeing that kind of that greenwashing as oil companies try to pretend that they can align with any sort of climate goals. And then you're seeing some even more, I would say, insidious sort of false solutions lobbying, CCS lobbyists in particular, folks pushing for essentially exit ramps for the fossil fuel industry that would allow them to continue business as usual while claiming potentially some emissions reductions, or rather even just delaying the inevitable, allowing them to continue to lock in more extraction, boost their profits, and screw over the climate. I think it's really dangerous. I would say there has been a lot more pushback to this rise in fossil fuel lobbyists than ever before. When we released those numbers, there's a lot of media attention around that. There's big, beautiful actions that are happening, pushing back against that. And there has been some real progress made toward essentially having to declare your affiliations and declare that you are a fossil fuel lobbyist if you're coming. And many countries, not all by any means, but many countries starting a real discussion around what it would look like to ban them from the talks. That's what the World Health Organization does for tobacco lobbyists, for instance. So there is precedent for that at this sort of conference. And I think that's what we're going to need if we're ever going to truly address the climate crisis, which we know will not only happen at these conferences, but I think is one important piece of it.
Would those guidelines be set by the UN or would they be set by the host countries?
They would be set by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change,
Okay.
the UN body that hosts the talks, yeah.
Yeah, okay. The other thing that strikes me as you're talking about that is it seems like the politics of oil in Latin America have really heated up in the last couple of months, maybe more over Venezuela. And I also know that there's like a border conflict between Venezuela and I think Guyana, which is also a little bit of a conflict between Exxon and Chevron, is my understanding.
That is correct.
It's a very interesting dynamic. I don't guess you're seeing any of that play out at COP.
Not necessarily that directly. I think there is very much an awareness of the Trump regime working to foment war in Venezuela, perhaps actively doing so. And that is certainly, oil is involved there among many other pieces. The ability of oil companies to do business in Venezuela, for instance, private oil companies. So that's been present. The other, I would say, biggest thing that we are seeing here in the region has been the very controversial decision by a portion of Lula's government, the Brazilian president's government, to permit oil drilling in some blocks of the Amazon rainforest here. And that is something that is massively opposed by the indigenous peoples of the Amazon. There's been incredible, beautiful actions inside and out opposing that decision, which came down just a couple of weeks ago. And I believe is being appealed. It's not finalized yet, and there are competing parts of the government sort of pushing back on that decision. But it is, I think, shows the reality and the challenges of phasing out fossil fuels more broadly, but also, especially in the context of not actually having the financial support provided by the global north to do that in an equitable way. So the politics remain fraught, as you say, and we're not out of the weeds yet.
One of the thing, as we're talking about geopolitics in the mix here, one other thing I wanted to ask you about is about the politics around Palestine. And I seem to recall last year in Baku, there was actually a good bit around what was going on in Gaza and Palestine was happening there. Granted, that's closer to Palestine, Israel than in Brazil, but I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, is there any conversation about that, the recent genocide, the ongoing genocide in Gaza?
There is, and I say that proudly. I think it's a conversation that didn't happen for far too long, but has really ramped up. And Palestine, also a lot on Sudan and the Congo and other genocides that are taking place, but I think a recognition that there is massive opposition to the genocide in Gaza overwhelmingly, and that it's deeply connected to the climate crisis on a few different levels. This is a region of the world where fossil fuels play a massive role. There are countries that are fueling this genocide by continuing to send crude oil and refined products to Israel. It's an environmental catastrophe in so many ways, in addition to being a human rights catastrophe. Civil society and many of the governments present absolutely see those connections and are making them known. My organization, Oil Change International, just yesterday, I guess it was, time is hard at COP, released a big new report showing the most recent fuel shipments to Israel from countries around the world and naming and shaming those countries. There have been beautiful, big demonstrations, both inside and outside the COP in solidarity with Palestine. Lots of kufias running around the building. I've got mine here. So that solidarity is really visible, and it's pretty unique in my own life as somebody who lives in the United States most of the time, to be able to connect with so many people from around the world and to be able to last night we had a conversation with a bunch of folks in a space in Belem outside the conference here, but about strategy for the global energy embargo on Palestine campaign or for Palestine and what that would look like. And we had people in the room from Brazilian oil workers loading ships here with oil that is going to the Mediterranean and being transferred in secret in Cyprus and in Italy to different ships, which is heading to Israel eventually. There's so many complicated pieces of this, but there are also so many people present who are campaigning on so many different nodes of this system. And so I think it's an incredibly important place to be drawing all those connections and to be building relationships that we can campaign to win with in the future.
So what countries are the biggest exporters of fuel to Israel?
Yeah, those countries some of them are not a surprise. Some of them are what you would expect. Azerbaijan and Russia are pretty near the top of the list, Kazakhstan as well. But the United States, Greece, Turkey, Italy are, I think, the next four. So that's the top 7 or 8. The United States is the only supplier of a very specific type of jet fuel that's used by Israeli fighter jets. So that's one big portion of it. I know nobody these days expects the U.S. to do anything otherwise under the Trump fascists, but that was true under Biden as well, as folks are aware.
Right. So my last question is about my governor, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who has traveled to Belem and is representing himself as the senior most U.S. politician there. I believe actually I was reading an article on a real quick scan before I got on with you about how he called Trump an invasive species when it comes to climate. But I'm wondering, how is Gavin being received down there?
I think it's both. I think people I think the second Trump regime, frankly, is received a little differently. I think opinions could differ, but there was a plausible case to be made to the world, at least for people who weren't paying close attention to U.S. politics, that the first Trump administration and that election was an aberration. And I think it was easy to believe after Biden won that, okay, things are back to normal. And I'm not saying the U.S. was a good actor at the climate talks.
Yeah.
In non-Trump years, they weren't really, but I do think the second time around, the way our politics have shifted, there's a recognition that, yeah, the U.S., maybe we do get 4 years every now and then. Maybe their winds are changing. We hope so. But also, maybe this isn't an aberration. Maybe this is part of who they are. And so the Trump administration not being here is actually very interesting. They're very much the elephant in the room, but they're also not able to actually obstruct things. They have not shown up in any capacity. And so, yeah, then you have folks like Governor Gavin Newsom. Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham of New Mexico is actually also here. And I'd say they were received pretty similarly. Newsom, of course, has bigger political ambitions, I think we both know. And so is certainly using that to his advantage.
Although, according to him, he hasn't decided yet.
Exactly.
He's decided.
But I think he was here to tout California's accomplishments. He signed a lot of agreements and kind of bilaterals with other subnational jurisdictions, but it wasn't all positive. I think many folks kind of bought his lines about California being a climate leader, and in some ways it is. He's also been doing some very important work standing up to Trump. At the same time, I think there were plenty of voices here in frontline communities who have been impacted by some of Newsom's choices and increased drilling, et cetera. And there were some tough questions for both Lujan Grisham and for Newsom about what it means to be claiming that mantle of climate leadership while actually not working to phase out fossil fuel production or fossil fuels at home in some ways. It's going to take some time, but the bill that Newsom signed that doubled down on drilling and drilling permits in California is definitely not the way to go. And so he got some tough questions from the audience. I think there was some serious pushback on that, and some media we're already seeing. So that's mostly from Americans. Again, outsiders don't necessarily know that context. I think they see him as an alternative to Trump, and rightly so. But I think those of us on the ground who are more closely involved, who are pushing on Newsom, want him to live up to that mantle of actual climate leadership, want him to support the bill to make polluters pay in California, want him to actually stop new drilling permits and phase out extraction. And he still has a chance to do that, but right now that's not guaranteed. And so that's very much the mood of kind of a couple feelings here in Belem.
Okay, right on. It is interesting. Trump is talking about opening up offshore drilling off of the coast of California, and Newsom is pushing.
He's been very clear on that. He called it dead on arrival. He said that in the media he was here, and I think that's great. And I think we are simply demanding that he feel the same way about onshore drilling, frankly, or the drilling that's under his control.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is that he's approved lots of other projects.
Absolutely.
Okay, that was the last of my questions. If folks wanted to just follow, there's a lot of politics going on in the U.S. right now. There's a lot going on in the media, like here at home. There's the Epstein files and things like that. But if folks want to keep up with what's going on at COP30, what should they check out? Who should they follow?
Yeah, my organization, Oil Change International, has a lot of that content on our handles. It's at Price of Oil on most things. I think it's at Oil Change on Blue Sky. The Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice is another great resource. That's an international climate justice coalition that has some good content going up on social media. Check out the COP30 hashtag as well. And because of the much more visible people's movements here, there's just a lot more going on, and I think a lot more traffic. So hopefully when you check out that hashtag, it won't just be boring negotiation, but also some of the beautiful people on the streets.
Yeah, I should throw out the organization where where my day job is, like, also there doing
absolutely
indigenous people. People could also check out Rainforest Action Network.
At the Rainforest Action Network, I name Amazon Watch
and Amazon Watch. Yeah. So, Collin, it's been great talking with you, and good luck down there. And I hope the rest of your trip and your time at COP goes well. Folks, we've been talking with Collin Rees with Oil Change International. If you like what you're hearing, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Listen to us on audio platform, give us a rate and review. And then if you really like us, go to greenredpodcast.org and hit the support button and become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. Collin, take care, stay safe, and make a lot of trouble.
Thank you, Scott.
Everybody else.
Thanks for holding it down back in the seat of empire.
Yeah, everybody else out there, misbehave and make lots of trouble. And we'll talk to you again soon.